Hey, how's it going guys? My name is Dom and welcome to today's video where I'm going to be showing you how to create your own JavaScript console using HTML, CSS, and of course JavaScript. Now, before jumping into the code, it's all going to be available down below if you want to download and follow along, but also it's important to mention that we're going to be using the eval function for today's video for this project. The reason is because of course we need to execute some JavaScript coming from the user, so it needs to be done. Now of course I'm going to recommend that you do not use eval on your client facing projects or websites because of course there are many security implications with that, so try and avoid it. But for today's video, this project is just a bit of fun, so we should be okay. Now as we can see here, this is going to be the JavaScript console which we're going to be creating in today's video. It's going to be full screen in your browser and you can enter in expressions or statements and it's going to execute them and then of course display them for you in a nice little history window that can scroll up and down. So pretty straightforward and definitely a decent learning experience. Alright, so starting us off inside a new empty HTML document, we're going to begin by working on the HTML and the CSS first before lastly moving on to the JavaScript. Alright, so when it comes to the HTML and CSS, you guys can go ahead and you can set up a page like this where you have a linked CSS style sheet as well as a linked JavaScript file. So I recommend you use the defer attribute here and put it in the head. That way the JavaScript is only going to load up once the page has finished loading, and it's going to reduce your chances of getting errors and things like that. So once you have a linked up CSS style sheet and JavaScript file, we can head inside the body of the HTML and begin by creating a new container for the whole console. So this right here is going to be the entire visible area of the console, the history and the input and so on. So we can make a new div with a class of console right here, then drop down. When it comes to this console, there's going to be two main parts. The first part is going to be the history section where you log out all the inputs and outputs, and the last section or the bottom section is going to of course be the actual input field itself where the user types in characters. So we can create a new div here called console-history, okay, and then drop down here and make a new input field. Now this of course is going to be your console input, so give this a class of something like console-input, as well as a autofocus property, attribute, and also a spell check of false. So we don't want spell check when entering code, and of course when the page first loads up, we want this input field to be focused. All right. Now, when it comes to logging out the inputs and the outputs, we can do this by using two divs, one div for the input and one div for the output. So inside the console history, let's create an example input-output pair. So inside here, we're going to say console-input-log, so a log of the input. Inside here, we can just say something like 1 + 2 + 3 as our expression, just for testing purposes, and do the exact same thing right down here. This time, of course, it's going to be the console output log, and this here is, of course, going to be your output line, and we can just make this 6 as a result of course, 1 + 2 + 3. So now we have the HTML set up. We can move on to the CSS to, of course, convert our HTML, which currently looks like this, into something like this here. So going back inside this page right here, I'll just close that one off. So now going back inside the HTML, we can move on to the CSS. All right, so when it comes to the CSS for this, it's going to be relatively straightforward. The first thing is going to be to assign a margin of 0 on the body. That way, we're going to allow us to have the console take up the entire width and height. We're also going to be able to set a font family for the console here. So we'll say console and everything inside of it, or should I just say everything inside the console is going to have a font family of monospace. So right here, you can choose your own monospace font, but I'm going to use monospace here. And also, of course, targeting now the console container itself. So when it comes to the console, I'm going to make it take up the entire width and height of the page. So we'll say a width of 100 VW and a height of 100 VH. So this just means, look, make it take up 100% of the visible width or viewport width and 100% of the viewport height. So make sure you do VH there for the height. All right. I'm going to also set a display of flex here. The flex is going to allow us to position the history on the top and the input field on the bottom. This is also paired with a flex direction here of column. That way they're going to be stacked on top of one another. If I save this here, go back in the browser, we can see that we don't get many changes here, but of course we have that monospace font and that full width and height. And we can also see that we have the separation here of the history and the input on the bottom. So right down here. Now, in order to allow the history to take up the entire height or what's remaining, we're going to get to that very shortly. But for now, we can simply also apply a background here of a very dark gray for the entire console itself. And now we're going to get something like this. So we're, of course, making some decent progress. But for now, let's now style up the console history. So making it take up the entire remaining height. So we can target the console-history class here, and we're going to say flex grow 1. This is now going to push the input field on the bottom. Save this back in the browser, refresh. We can see now the input field is on the bottom, so the history takes up the entire remaining space of the height. Okay, going back down here, we can apply a box sizing of border box alongside a padding of 24 pixels just to create some space around the edges of the history window, as well as an overflow Y of auto. That way, once we continue to add, console history items, as it goes, longer than the whole height of the history, we're going to add a scroll bar, and that's what that overflow Y is doing, giving you a scroll bar for the history. Okay, cool. We can now also hop down here and we can style up the console input log class and the console output log. So styling up every single individual either input or output inside the history section. So for this, give it a box sizing of border box and a padding here of 6 pixels top and bottom and 12 pixels left and right. By the way, if I didn't mention earlier, box sizing of border box is going to make it so the padding does not increase the overall width and height of your div or your input log in this case. Okay, save this back in the browser, refresh, and we get something like this. Of course, because the text is still black, we're not able to see it, but we can see there we have that padding on the container, and of course that individual padding on every single input or output right there. Cool. We can now just add a different background when the user hovers over either the input or the output. So we can copy all of this stuff here and just add a colon hover to those selectors there. And now also apply here just a background change. So we'll just say here background, setting it to be GBA 255, 255, 255, and then 0.03 for 3% opaque white. Now, if I was to save this, go back in the browser, refresh, we can see now we get a nice, very subtle, background color change when hovering over those inputs or those outputs. Okay. We can now style up the input log specifically. So for this one, we want the input logs to be white in color. So we'll say color to be white, just like that, and a font weight of bold. Save this back in the browser, refresh, and we get this right here. And next up, we can style the output in a very similar fashion. So we can say console output log. And for these ones, we can simply just make them normal font weight, but change the color. I'm going to be using the color here of 00FFCC for light green. Save this back in the browser, refresh, and we get something like this. So now it's going to be all about styling up the input field on the bottom. So when it comes to styling up that one, we can simply target the console-input class, and we're going to be assigning a flex shrink of 0. This is going to ensure that under no circumstances the input field is going to shrink when the page gets too small or the size of the history container gets too large. Okay, as well as a box sizing of border box and a padding of 12 pixels. Now, try and keep this 12 pixel padding, if you decide to change it, try and keep it the same value as your output and input log. So if you want to change it to be 20 pixels here, then make this one 20 and this one 10. So just for consistency there, make sure all those values are synced up. So I'm going to use 12 pixels here. as well as a border of none on the input field, but then a border top of 1 pixel, then solid, and then 333 for a gray. Save this back in the browser, refresh, and we get something like this. So the main part now is going to be to change the background color and of course the text color for this. So we can now say a text color of white. We're going to also just remove the default outline here. So we just say outline equal to none. And lastly, a background of RGBA. Then we can say 255, 255, 255, and then 0.05 for 50% opaque white background. Save this back in the browser, refresh, and we get this right here. Now, one last thing to do in the CSS is going to be to add a very subtle background color change when the user hovers over and also focuses on the input field. So back inside here, we can just say console input : hover. When hovering over, or you are focused on the input field, so typing in something, we can just say a background here, copy the same value and increase this by 2%, being 0.07. Alongside this, we can also add a transition for the background property. We can just say a background transition of 0.2 seconds, and now it's going to be a nice transitional fade. Save this back in the browser, refresh, hover over the input field, and we get that nice background color change. So everything is done when it comes to the HTML and the CSS. It's now going to be up to the JavaScript to, of course, add the functionality and make this thing work. Okay, so when it comes to the JavaScript for this project, we're going to begin by making sure that we have the defer attribute set on the script tag inside the head of the document. That way, the code is going to execute only once the page is finished loading. But if you don't want to do that, you can also just include this at the end of your body without the defer attribute, and you're going to get the same result basically. So once you have this set up correctly inside the main.js file, we can begin by defining two constants. So inside here, we're going to say const console input equal to document.query selector, getting the first element with a class of console-input. Of course, this one here is going to be our input field where the user types in some code. So we have that input field. We can make a second constant here called history container. This of course refers to our history container. This will be called console-history in the class, of course, giving us this main container right there. It's also going to be a good time for us to remove the sample log input output. So we can remove those two lines right there. Of course, the JavaScript is going to be the one that's going to be generating that HTML. So back inside here, we can create a function called addResult. So this function is going to add a new history item, the input and the output, to the container. So it's going to take in two arguments. The first one is going to be the input as a string, so what the user actually typed in. The second one is going to be the output. Now the output is going to be the return result of the eval function. So this right here can be a number, a string, object, array, whatever the statement or expression returned in eval, that is what's going to go inside here. So as an example, we'll call this function straight away. We'll say add result, then do as the input 1 + 2 + 3, and let's say we get the result of 6 for this. Okay, so we can call it like this, and now of course go inside here and do a couple of things. So we're going to say firstly a new constant called output as string. So converting the output into a string representation. This is because of course we want the output to be represented as a string. That way the user can of course read it in the history. So we can just say, look, if the output, okay, is an instance of an array, okay, then we're going to simply join the array with a comma and add some square brackets around it. I'll show you why we need to do this very shortly, but for now, we can just say, using the template strings right here, we can add new square brackets, then inside here, add the $ and the curly braces to include this here. We'll say output.join, then join by a comma and a space, okay? So we can now say if it's not an array, then we're going to simply call the output.toString. So calling a string conversion on the eval output. Okay, Now, why do we need to have this instance of array stuff? So I want to show you right now, back in the browser, if I go inside the actual console here, we can just type out this. We're going to say an array of 1, 2, and 3, then call the toString function or method. I call it and we get this right here. So this is what the user would see in the history. We don't want this. We want to have the actual array, with the square brackets. Okay, so we need to, of course, make that check. And if it is an array, then of course, add the square brackets and join it with a comma and a space. Otherwise, we're good to go. We can simply convert it to a string. Okay, so now we'll say console.log. We'll log out the input as a string and the output as a string just to see how we're going with the progress. Save this back in the browser, do a refresh here. In the console, we get 1, 2, 3 as our input string and of course 6 as our output. If I make the output here an array of 1, 2, and 3 as an example, right? Save this, refresh. We get the array right there. So now, of course, it's all working perfectly fine. We can now, of course, add this to the HTML. So going back inside the add result function, we can now create two elements, one for the input and one for the output log. So we'll say here, right up here, const input log element equals document.create element. And we can just say inside here, creating a new div element. Also, an output log element, also going to be a new div. We can assign a class to these ones. So we're going to say here, input log element, dot class list dot add. We're going to add the class of console-input-log. That way, the CSS styles we wrote earlier are going to apply to it. Same thing for the output. So of course, output log element, and changing both of those in the class name and of course the constant to be output. Okay. Next up, we can simply assign some text content inside these elements. So for the input log element, we'll just say .text content equal to, and then use once again the backticks here. And we're going to say a new, what do you call those things? Greater than sign. And we're going to say here, input as string. So what the user has inputted, before having or after having a greater than sign. There we go. Also, an output log element .text content. This here is simply just going to be the output. So we'll just say here the output as a string. So making some good progress, we can now simply append these two newly created divs to the container. So we'll say here history container.append, then append here the input log element, and of course the output log element. Save this back in the browser, refresh, and we get this right here, those two newly created HTML divs. Perfect, okay? So now let's make the input field work and of course call this function when the user presses enter. So for this, gonna hop right down here, remove this line of code, and we're gonna say console input.addEventListener. So we're gonna say here key up. When the user presses a key, then releases it. Okay, so basically when they're typing inside the input field, we're going to simply grab onto the event object right there, and dropping down here, the first thing to do is going to be to actually retrieve the user's input. So we'll say here const code equal to console input dot value dot trim. So dot trim is going to of course remove the white space from the start and the end of the user input. We can now just say console.log the code, save this back in the browser. I want to show you how this works. So on a refresh, if I start typing, we get a new console log every single time I press a key. Okay, perfect. Now, dropping down here, we can now check. We'll say, look, if the user's code.length is equal to 0, so basically if they've entered no code at all, we're going to simply return and do nothing, okay? But if the user did actually submit some lines of code, then we can drop down here. We're going to check, okay, look, if e.key equal to enter. So if they press the enter key, of course, now we're going to want to, submit that and call this function. So if they press enter, we're going to say try, and then we're going to say catch. Okay. So here is where we're now going to call the eval function. So for this, we can say add result. Okay. We can call that function from above. here passing through the user input. It's going to be code, okay? Then the output here is going to be eval, and we're going to evaluate that code. So we can just say here, code, just like that. Now, the reason for the try catch is because this eval could throw an error. So if it throws an error, okay, we can simply catch it, and we're going to simply do the same thing. So add the result, but this time we're going to pass in the event object, the error object. So I might make this E actually. So ERR, that way it's different from our E up here. So making this one ERR for the error and this one here E for the event. So two different things, going to catch the error and then submit it to the add result. That way the error is going to appear in the history. And lastly, in any case, right, anytime the user presses enter, I'm going to simply say console input dot value equal to a new empty string. I'm going to save this, go back in the browser, refresh here, then I'm going to say 1 plus 2 plus 3. Press enter and we get 6 right there. Let's make an intentional syntax error. I'm going to say 1, comma, enter, and we get syntax error right there, and it's all logging out perfectly fine. Let's add some more. 1 plus 5, we get 6. Let's do 6 plus 10, we get 16. Now, there's a scroll bar. Let's scroll down, that's good, but if I keep doing things, A plus B plus C, we can see that we have to keep scrolling down. So to get around that, go back inside here, we're going to say history container dot scroll top, okay, equal to history container dot scroll height. So this right here is going to make your history container always be scrolling to the bottom when you press enter. Back in the browser, refresh, add some more lines of code, do it a few times here. So do that, do it again, do it again, do it again. We can see now, our code is being, or our history is being pushed down, and the scroll bar is on the bottom every time you press enter. And that's it, we're all done. So that is how to create your own JavaScript console using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, drop a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.